All right, so we're doing Chapter 23, Vascular Tumors. So this first one is an angiokeratoma, and from scan, I like the description in Elston's book where he says basically it's kind of like this really bloody hemorrhagic SK. And that does help you to delineate between an angiokeratoma and a lymphangioma, because lymphangioma can be very bloody sometimes, but it's not necessarily the amount of blood that makes it an angiokeratoma. Certainly this is a lot of red blood cells, and so that would hint at it being angiokeratoma and not a lymphangioma. But it's more this acanthosis, this seborrheic keratosis-like architecture, a little bit of hyperkeratosis on top. So it's kind of more of that really pushes it into a true angiokeratoma versus a lymphangioma. And there's some overlaps, but it does make a little bit of difference, as you guys know clinically. Depending on the location and if you're, some syndrome like Fabry's or something, but that's really the big things that kind of help to delineate between angiokeratoma and lymphangioma. Okay, jumping straight from that into number 2, which is nodular capices, probably on the palm or somewhere acral, maybe on the foot. And from scan here, this one, you got this kind of ball of spindly, vascular-looking tissue there in the dermis. And, from scan, you can hopefully get to it's something, certainly something neoplastic in a sense. It's something that's proliferating. It's, has all this hemorrhagic blood throughout. And so that makes you think of something vascular. And then in terms of getting to capices, capices goes through all the different phases, the patch and plaque and nodular, and by the time you get to nodular, it's usually a little bit more on the spindle cell side and a little less on those tiny little kind of slit-like vessels and promontory sign and all that other stuff that we learn about. And they can be pretty dense. And so here, it's really more dense than anything else, this kind of dense spindle cell proliferation. There still are some remnants of kind of this slit-like vasculature architecture, and then there's this layering in of these red blood cells, and ideally you even see single file erythrocytes, kind of through here, which is basically just how packed in they are. You'll often see hemosiderin. Just from more the chronic, red blood cell degeneration that's happening. And then there's usually plasma cells throughout. You may see a little bit of atypia in the neoplastic cells, but not typically as much as angiosarcoma. And then there's also, not like you really have to be looking for this, but there's something called dwarf balls. That's a real thing. Let's see if I can find some. They're basically these little vacuoles within the vascular cells. They're pretty small, though. I found some earlier, but I won't spend too much time looking for them. But they're these tiny. They almost look like the degenerating red blood cells in like a glomerular hemangioma. Well, I found some earlier, but okay. You'll just have to trust me on that one. You can Google it, but there's actually little, vacuole things that you can see.
What are they called?
Dwarf balls. DORF. Yeah. Okay, and then that's what it makes me go. Number 3 is going back to the patch stage of capices. And so here, you can see why this would be, or why this is challenging. From scan, it can almost be hard to even see that there's much going on. Your eyes will then start to pick up on these little vascular proliferations, but they're pretty subtle. This is a pretty big lesion, though, but if it's a very small lesion, it can be very difficult. As you get closer in, you can start to see that there's maybe some kind of slit-like architecture and these atypical vascular spaces that are being formed. And then intermixed throughout there's probably some plasma cells, maybe a hint of hemosiderin, and some extravasated red blood cells. And if they, usually there's not a whole lot of atypia. The other thing that Kaposi's likes to do, by the way, is it likes to wrap around itself, and it likes to wrap around adnexae. And so you can see, kind of like down here, for example, it's sort of wrapping around these adnexal structures. And then when it wraps around itself, that's when you start to get the promontory sign as it gets a little bit more developed. Here it's still pretty subtle. And, sorry, I'm getting over cold. The endothelial cells are not as atypical as angiosarcoma, but that's on the differential. And so you see these little kind of slit-like network of vascular proliferation. And so, we'd throw a HHV8 stain on this as well as some other things, usually CD31, CD34, maybe D240, to kind of help tease out. That one is Kaposi's. This is number 4, and it is a glomus tumor. And I remember in derm residency, questioning like, well, what's the cutoff between glomus tumor and glomangioma? Does it really matter? And certainly there are the two ends of the spectrum, two kind of separate entities. When it's just sheets of glomus cells like this, it's very obviously a glomus tumor. Whereas when that vascular component starts to kind of predominate, then it becomes glomangioma. And here from scan, you might be thinking, any type of proliferation. Certainly there's vascular spaces in here, but it's not until you get a little bit closer that you can start to make out this monotonous appearance to these cells, and they all kind of look the same. They're all very round and regular appearing. I mean, they're very evenly spaced. They have a characteristic appearance to them. Let me just get this in focus. And so, they're very, again, very monotonous is kind of the key word. And then if you kind of look out at the periphery, you can start to see that they actually line up as this sort of string of pearls that we talk about. And then that kind of helps you make the diagnosis of a glomus tumor. And you wouldn't see this on derm boards, but it is good to know. Excuse me. It is good to know that you can't have malignant glomus tumors and glomangiomas, so they can actually turn bad. So that's a glomus tumor. Okay, so number 5 is a pyogenic granuloma or lobular capillary hemangioma. And, of course, we're trying nowadays to go more to that LCH terminology. It's certainly very descriptive. I still call it a PG, though, just out of habit, but, it's very much lobulated or lobular. And it's going to be this kind of capillary-sized vessels, not like large or thick-walled vessels. It's just these small capillary-sized vessels that's in this well-defined kind of lobular proliferation. Very superficial in the dermis, often forming this, not necessarily pedunculated, but this, very much, kind of papilloma on the clinically. That's what you're going to be seeing. Often there's some hyperkeratosis over top of it, but that can, as you guys know, get eroded to where it's just sort of bleeding and almost ulcerated. Sometimes there's a collarette that goes around it. I think on this other cut there's maybe a little bit of a collarette if I can find it. I mean, it's pretty subtle, but there's a little collarette around it. And so that is a pyogenic granuloma. And one of the things on differential is bacillary angiomatosis, which of course we don't see that often, but there is one of those in here, and it's not going to be as well kind of defined as this, and there'll be more neutrophils all over, and you have somewhat different clinical history. Okay. So number 6, this one is ALHE, or angiolymphoid hyperplasia with eosinophils. And again, from scan, you can hopefully pick up that there are some lymphoid follicles over here with actual germinal center formation. So, that almost looks like lymph node. I mean, it's just this lymphoid proliferation form, but it's kind of normal appearing, meaning it has this normal architecture and, again, normal germinal center appearance and everything. So it looks normal. It's just more this reactive lymphoid hyperplasia. And then that is on this background of this proliferation, which is more vascular. And you can see, there's these larger kind of central vessels, and then around it there's all these tiny vessels. And it's just this, as the name implies, this angiolymphoid hyperplasia. And then there's all the eosinophils too. So if you get in closer, you can start to make out that this thing is just jam-packed full of eosinophils. And so this is a great one for the boards because it can be kind of confusing at scan, and then it's, hopefully as you're going through it in your mind, you're just kind of saying out loud, but not out loud, but in your mind of kind of what you're seeing, you'll kind of be like, wow, there's a kind of this vascular hyperplasia proliferation with eosinophils, and they'll kind of pop to the ALHE diagnosis. Usually there's also the hobnailing of the endothelium of these vessels, particularly the larger ones. And here, again, it's kind of more the peripheral small vessels. Some hobnailing out here too. So that's that hobnailing for the first years. That's where you get that sort of mounded appearance to the endothelial cells. Getting a little closer. So it just speaks to how these are kind of these little mounds, and they can be pretty pronounced hobnailing. And that can be a clue, obviously, for different things like THH and ALHE and other things where you get that hobnailing. Okay. Number 7, this is one of 3 IPEH, or the intravascular papillary endothelial hyperplasia, or Mason's tumor. And that can happen in kind of anything vascular. This maybe was like a lymphangioma, or probably not an angiokeratoma, but in any sort of hemangioma or vascular proliferation or anything, you can get a thrombus, which is what this is here, and then as the body starts to attempt to recanalize that, that's where you get this IPEH. And sometimes they can get pretty pronounced, and we learn about it for a couple reasons. One is it's just good to know that such things happen and can form this pseudo-tumor appearance. But one of the other reasons is because it can at times start to look like something that's bad. I mean, it can almost look like it's forming promontory signs, like it's capices or it's angiosarcoma or something like that. And so it's on the differential for things. And so on a test, you don't want to zone in on this spot and on this spot, and then start going down the route of angiosarc or capices, and forget to kind of step away and realize that it's just within this large thrombus, and it's really not anywhere else, and it's nothing more than the IPEH. Okay, that's number 8. This one is Angiosarcoma, and from scan you can see that there is certainly something going on in the dermis, and you can hopefully make out that there are, again, some of these little slit-like vascular spaces, and so you can see why the differential includes capices and some of these other things that fall into the same differential. The periphery of THH can look, kind of like capices and things. But this is much more dense. I mean, this is a very dense hypercellular proliferation. And so certainly the slit-like vascular spaces can help you to get into the vascular box. But But then when you're teasing out, is this something bad, or is this something almost bad, like CAPCs, in terms of cancerous? This is just much more dense and hypercellular. And then the endothelial cells within these vascular spaces are much larger, hyperchromatic, and more atypical as you get closer in. And hopefully the proliferation makes it easy on you, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they can be deceptively bland looking, and so then you really have to rely on that hypercellularity, or seeing maybe an occasional atypical cell or mitosis or something like that. And mitoses, of course, aren't super reliable because you can get those in CAPCs and in other things as well. But here, these are just incredibly large and hyperchromatic and atypical endothelial cells, and there's just so many of them. Again, it's very, even just in a small subset of this whole larger lesion, they're just very dense and kind of almost growing over themselves. And so that really pushes you to think that it's angiosarc, and we do some more stains, you kind of do more to kind of tease it out. But here you can also kind of appreciate that they're just large and almost epithelioid, which they really don't do as much or to this scale with things like CAPCs and other stuff on the differential. So that was Angiosarc. And of course, you can get post-radiation angiosarcomas, which are c-MYC amplified, whereas c-MYC is not amplified in the atypical vascular lesions or the kind of run-of-the-mill angiosarcs. So this is a lymphangioma. I'll try to turn it right side up for at least some of you. And compared to the very first one that was an angiokeratoma, again, there's some. They kind of overlie each other in terms of morphology, but these are usually much more thin, kind of, but very large, dilated vascular spaces, hardly any blood inside. You may actually see true lymph, which that could be some lymph down there. And then more of these very thin, hyperplastic, reedy ridges, but not really as much acanthosis. Now this one does have a little bit of acanthosis and some hyperkeratosis, but it doesn't look as much as that sort of seborrheic keratosis-like architecture that the angiokeratoma did. Ultimately on a test, if they put both lymphangioma and angiokeratoma as an answer choice, that's not very nice, but hopefully they wouldn't, and they would just maybe put other things. But if they did, then you want to try to tease out those things. Does it look like a really bloody, almost hemorrhagic seborrheic keratosis, or does it have these, just this large kind of, but thin, kind of delicate epidermal strands and things, and look more like a lymphangioma. So, good luck with that. Okay. Well, this is number 10, and it's bacillary angiomatosis. And, from scan, it's just sort of this dense dermal collection of either a proliferation or inflammatory cells. It's kind of hard to say. At the periphery, you can see that there are some vascular spaces, and so you might be thinking, well, maybe this is some sort of true vascular proliferation. Maybe it's even Alhi because there's so many inflammatory cells here. But this is kind of almost like necrosis. That you shouldn't really be getting that with Alhi. And we need to get down and see what kind of inflammatory cells there are. And we're not really seeing lymphoid follicles either. So it's certainly not like a well-defined reactive lymphoid proliferation. Instead, it is kind of this vascular proliferation. It's supposed to be more capillary-sized vessels. There's a little bit larger ones here and there, but generally speaking, it's kind of this capillary proliferation with areas of necrosis, and then lots and lots of neutrophils as you get in closer. And basically, this thing is just wall-to-wall with neutrophils. And that makes you think infectious, and in the realm of this capillary proliferation, that would make you think bacillary angiomatosis. Now you may get lucky too and see some like amphiphilic bacterial colonies and things. I don't really see any right now offhand, but that can certainly help you too if you can actually see some stuff that's suggestive of organisms. But this is bacillary angiomatosis. Okay, so this one is just a AVM, or arteriovenous malformation, and this one is a pretty good one because sometimes we, in derm path, if we see a lot of capillary hemangiomas or little cherry angiomas. Those are usually pretty easy to diagnose. They've got more hyalinized vessels. They're all sort of the same size and this, well defined up in the superficial dermis. But when it comes to calling something an AVM, ideally you really want to see a mixture of sizes of vessels. So you want to see these larger, thick-walled vessels mixed in or malformed with all these tiny little capillary-sized vessels, and that's really what makes it a true AVM, and versus just some other run-of-the-mill hemangioma. There's even kind of a deeper component here where you can see, again, kind of that this malformation between these thicker-walled vessels. They're not only large vessels, but they're thick-walled, and then all these tiny little capillary-sized vessels. So that's really what makes it a true AVM, and we don't always see them this well defined, but so sometimes AVM can become sort of this kind of diagnosis of exclusion when it doesn't fit anything else, and it's just this otherwise benign hemangioma, but it has some subtle changes in the vascular size. So that was more of a true AVM. Okay, this is another IPEH. And you can see here, it's just this large thrombus, which is basically what all this is here. And over here, different stages. And then over here is where you can start to see the kind of that recanalization occurring, giving you that almost proliferative appearance and a little atypical or seemingly atypical slit-like vascular spaces and pseudopromontory signs and things like that. So basically another IPEH. I think there's some more over here, down there. Okay, 13. This is another capices, and since we've done this one already, we'll kind of go through it quickly, but this is just another nodular capices. And it's kind of more dense spindle cells, maybe some single filing of erythrocytes. Going to be hemosiderin in there. You definitely want to stain this. This one's so characteristic you really wouldn't need to, but you would be positive for HHV8, and maybe if you're lucky, you could find some Dorf balls. Yeah. Okay. 14. This one's a spindle cell hemangioendothelioma, and these are, basically like hemangiomas. They often have this hemorrhagic lung kind of appearance, where it's just these large, dilated, red blood cell filled spaces. You can often get phlebolyths. I don't know where the L is in that, but that's what this is here. And but then somewhere in here, there's kind of supposed to be a spindly cell component, and so kind of over here is where you could see some spindle cells in here, and that's really what makes it more the spindle cell type of the hemangioendothelioma. But it's really that from scans, that kind of hemorrhagic lung appearance with the occasional phlebolyths, and then sometimes small area of spindle cell proliferation. Okay, 15 is yet another IPEH. So basically a big thrombus, probably within a vessel or something, and then can kind of see some recanalization.
Is that another MUSC?
Yeah, another IPE, Angiosarcoma tumor. So here you can see that kind of recanalization. Okay. So this one is the targetoid hemosiderotic hemangioma, or hobnail hemangioma. And these ones can be pretty subtle. But ideally what you see is in the center is kind of more of a central, slightly larger vessel, which maybe, these are probably two cuts, maybe it's bisected. So, maybe over here is where you're seeing this kind of central, larger vascular structure, and large being relative here. And then at the periphery, so again, kind of going over here, at the periphery, you get these thin, small, little, almost capices-like, slit-like vascular spaces, kind of more at the periphery. And then when you go in to look closer, ideally you see, some hobnailing of the endothelium, hence the name. So you can really see the hobnailing here. And then ideally you also see hemosiderin, hence the name. But I was looking at this earlier. I didn't really see a whole lot of hemosiderin, and that's, you may not see that depending on where the cut is in the biopsy, the stage of the lesion, how much hemosiderin actually been produced. But it's more so this is on the differential with capices because of these peripheral sides where it can form these kind of like vascular spaces, but. The clinical would be helpful, plus the just the architecture of that central vessel within sort of this otherwise pretty small vascular proliferation with the periphery, really just the periphery that kind of looks like capices. And speaking from my own experience, there are other things clinically that can give you a targetoid appearance. When I was a first year, I had a patient came in, and I was so excited because clinically it literally had a target. It was like a tiny little bump with a target around it, and I biopsied it thinking it would be a THH, and it was just a nevus, traumatized nevus. So other things that get traumatized and can produce that vascular, just basically bleeding, it can still do it in a targetoid fashion and kind of mimic it clinically. So this is just a kind of a deeper lymphangioma. It's the answer is written as lymphatic malformation, and so instead of being kind of this well circumscribed collection of dilated superficial lymphatic spaces that are kind of abutted to the epidermis, if not kind of wrapped within it. This is just a little bit deeper in the dermis, probably even goes a little bit into this skeletal muscle. Lymphatic malformations can go incredibly deep to the point where you have cystic hygromas and things of that nature. And so this is one, though, that we would stain, and it would end up being D240 positive, and we'd say, okay, well, it's lymphatic, and then to the clinician, depending on what you see clinically, you might need to image it, you might need to see how deep it goes, or it could just be slightly deeper but still pretty small and not a big deal lymphatic malformation. And this is another angiokeratoma. This is the last one, number 18. And so here again you can see that it really has almost a seborrheic keratosis-like architecture. The first one was even better because it had that little horn cyst. But it's this very bloody, almost hemorrhagic look to it. It has some pretty decent acanthosis with overlying hyperkeratosis that is really just around this lesion, because you look at the periphery and it kind of thins out a little bit, gets a little bit more normal. And so that really speaks to being an angiokeratoma versus being a lymphangioma. And that's it.
Thanks, Justin.